All right, welcome everybody to our second talk of the semester. This is the semester where we are looking at this notion of traditions and transition. We're looking at how Tantric traditions change and adapt and evolve over time. And very excited for today's speaker. Many of us have known for a long time the importance of krama to some of these traditions that are so dear to us, such as, the Anuttara Trika of Acharya Abhinavagupta. But more and more, what we're coming to realize is that these traditions are not bound in single geographies. They're tied throughout the subcontinent. And more and more, we're understanding a little bit more about these interconnections. And we're understanding kind of the civilizational nature, the cross-geographic nature of tantric traditions. So today we're going to be hearing a lot about Tantra in Kerala. And our speaker is exceptionally well suited to be teaching us about these things. So he is Dr. Maciej Karasinski, and he got his PhD in Sanskrit literature at the University of Calicut and his MA in Indian philology as well. He's been a visiting scholar. He's participated in academic projects in Sanskrit and Malayalam manuscripts, and he received a scholarship from the government of India to conduct his research in Kerala. He is already a doctor, but he's also getting a second PhD in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. And he just published a really important book through Routledge called The Cultural Heritage of Shakta Tantra Communities in India. And I will be sharing a link to learn more about that book right now in the chat. But without any further ado, I'd like to have our speaker begin, and he'll be teaching us a little bit about the Shakta Tantra and Mantravada in Kerala. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to join you today and share some of my observations on Shakta Tantra and Mantravada in Kerala. So it's a vast subject and it's a very complex one. And I would like, in the first part of my presentation today, I would like to introduce certain aspects of Shakta Tantra in Kerala and what it's called Shakteya, the local um, traditions of goddess worship that in many cases combine elements of Shrividya or Krama worship, but they have the unique flavor and certain elements that I feel are worth researching and discussing because we can learn more about how tantric traditions coexist and how the transmission of mantras, of ritual systems persist in modern times. And the other part of the title of my presentation today refers to Mantravada as the practice of mantras in general, but also the term Mantravada has a particular connotation in Kerala as a kind of family-specific esoteric practice related to the mantras that can be used to in case of wish-fulfilling rituals, but also to control and invoke different type of spiritual beings. And Mantravada is also used to the term Mantravada is also used in discussion on an empowerment and mastery of mantras. A person. The one question I will be asking today is who actually is a Mantravadi, who has this status, who has this role in modern Kerala tradition. So that's the first part that I would like to talk briefly about what my reflections are on Shakta Tantra and Mantravada in Kerala. And in the second part of my presentation, I focus more on text related to the rituals, so ritual manuals. That primary source that I will be using today, that the first one would be the manuscript preserved in a family tradition in the northern part of Kerala that I also edited for my book and interpreted in the light of Krama sources. But I would like to point to certain elements that are quite unique in the way the text presents itself. It opens itself to practitioners, to the wider audience, and how the mantras are presented there. There is a part of the text that relates to Mantravada and how the mantras can be constructed and how they can be also combined with others. Formulas and other mantric practices. So I feel it's important to look at that section of the text because the way the mantras are used and combined shows us something about an interrelation between the traditions, the living ones, and also the traditions that were inherited from the generation of practitioners. That's as I said. Um, Let me just yes start with the brief introduction. And if we visit Kerala and we discussed with practitioners of tantric systems, many of these tantric systems are preserved in families, in family groves, so-called kavus. In many cases, we have the idea of goddess worship, where you have a family and a Kula Devata, a particular patron or protector of the family in the form of a very fierce and powerful goddess. But we also have these family traditions with different forms of empowerment. We can usually, when we talk about the goddess traditions and goddess worship, we use the term Shakta Tantra to refer to tantric traditions of goddess worship in general, network of religious traditions, how they developed, and also the idea of Shakti. And in this context, we also have in Kerala the term Shakteya that many times is used interchangeably with Shakta Tantra, but this term has also a specific connotation because it refers to a local constellation of interconnected traditions in Kerala, center of worship of fierce, often demon slaying goddesses, and involving rituals, sometimes rituals of possession, sometimes certain ceremonies that involve and offerings of, for instance, alcohol, sometimes meat. So certain offerings that are usually referred as a kala sort of offerings, but these traditions, when we discuss, when we do more research about, we can see certain elements of Sri Vidya, and to the point where some practitioners would basically refer to Sri Vidya as a Shakteya because it is a Shakta Tantra, but Shakteya and those traditions of goddess worship in those particular families would have initiation in many other goddess traditions. So that's an important part. If we visit those centers, those temples, or in some uh, cases, sacred groves, we may notice in many cases Sri chakras installed them. But then the question is how these Sri chakras are performed. Do we have the same form of Navavarana puja, or is there some kind of special and unique system? Well, in some cases, it is the case. There are certain unique forms of practice. Sometimes we have um, rituals, and Sri Chakra is only a symbol of empowerment, certain source of empowerment actually, and there is an archana done for Sri Chakra while other goddesses are invoked. So Shakta here, I would like to stress, has a very specific flavor, very specific local system that is a constellation of interconnected traditions. So that's one term that I wanted to talk about. And when we read the studies on Tantra in Kerala that recently published, we may notice other terms that are commonly used to name certain traditions, certain communities as well. So I just quote one source, but we have a lot of studies now being published, and we also have the classic studies like a study by Professor Unni about the complexity of tantric systems in Kerala. So most cases that we have terms like Vaidika Tantra used, for instance, as the most popular tantric system in Kerala that we can notice in the rituals, or the temple rituals in many of the temples in Kerala, and the Vaidika Tantra has its specific ritual system that it's mostly based on what we now can see in Tantra Samuchaya, and we talk about the different systems of preserved by Nambudiri Brahmins in what it's generally called a Vaidika Tantra. Then we have the interesting term, the Mantravada, as also indication of certain type of mantra practice or tantric tradition, where Mantravadin is basically an expert who can use mantras from different sources, may receive an empowerment from the generations from his ancestors, and when I interview people who were known and also introduce themselves as Mantravadins, then they often talk about the ancestor spirits as being with them and teaching them. And that's another case of tantric practice where we have a notion also in modern times of diksha and initiation and mantras given not only by gurus but also directly from gods or goddesses, and from the ancestors. So while discussing this case with several practitioners, they also revealed, for instance, that certain mantras they received through direct visions of the forefathers and goddesses. So that's what I wanted to mention today. When we talk about these different traditions, we also may talk a bit about different forms of empowerment and the sources of empowerment. And in Mantravadin is basically a term used to in multiple contexts. So it can be anyone with a particular mastery of mantras. But in this case, I would like to talk about certain family traditions where Mantravadins are basically also healers, basically someone who can deal with spiritual problems. It might be invited, for instance, where when someone may suffer from spiritual disturbances, so some form of evil possession, for instance. And Mantravadins are those who know how to use mantras to make things happen, so to say. And we have also mentioned in several publications terms like Shaktiya Brahmins, and I use this term also in my publication, in my articles, to name certain communities who also claim empowerment by stating and stressing that they are Brahmins, they belong to a Brahmin communities, but they follow a different rules of purity, for instance, because they also have this Shakta empowerment. So they feel at the same time different from other Brahmin communities because of connection with um, Kaula sources, because of connection with certain forms of empowerment, fierce goddesses, for instance. But they also have the status of Brahmins. Now, this term implies that the Shaktiya tradition is preserved only within Brahmin communities. It's not so. The Shaktiya practitioners are actually come from different communities. Sometimes they actually travel to be initiated by gurus who are also from other castes, other communities. So what I wanted to stress after publishing those articles on Shaktiya Brahminic traditions I got in contact with communities, for instance, of Nayars in northern Kerala, in Kannur, who introduced themselves as Mantrika Nayars. Again, there is a term that refers to the mastery of mantras, and these families, these communities, again, they confirm that they received, for instance, an empowerment from Kali Kalasamkarshni directly in a vision. So that complicates these type of divisions and clear distinction between certain tantric practices or tantric communities. That's what I would like to point to. That as we do research and we introduce the certain communities who preserve the tantric traditions, we kind of put them into certain categories, but these categories are not that strict. These transmissions of knowledge are actually going in many different directions, and that's what I'm showing you here is just for an orientation rather than to stress that these are names that are really restricted practitioners in certain categories. It's much more complicated. How complicated? Well, when I talk about the traditions of Mantravada, for instance, that's inspires me to do more research about those traditions because the term is used basically with names of particular families. So particular families are not identifying themselves with, let's say, what we now call a Krama tradition or Srividya, but they have this empowerment from multiple sources, and mostly it's a hereditary practice. We have practitioners who received some mantras, for instance, from their father, and then had to travel to another part of Kerala to receive another initiation, to become, for instance, to receive a Purna Abhisheka in Srividya, to be able to, let's say, work with rituals that were forgotten. There is a notion that obviously certain practices are in need of a new research, but also practitioners themselves, they say, well, we inherited manuscripts from my forefathers, but certain rituals needs to be renewed. Certain rituals need to be rediscovered, and for that we need an empowerment from another guru who knows the mantras and who can initiate me. So these type of transmissions are not, only in the family, because we have obviously certain elements that are now lost for different reasons. So there is this concept of Mantravada as a practice of use of mantras from several different sources. And here, talking about this topic, I would like to briefly tell you a story. The story that from Aitihyamala, a collection of legends, collection of stories, a beautiful actually book written by Shankuni. who collected the stories from different parts of Kerala. And in one of his chapters, he talks about a story of brothers from Tia community who mastered the Ganapati mantra and had a great experience and ability to use this mantra for different reasons. But they were also greedy in some ways to learn more, and they found during the practice they met a Brahmin Mantravadin, and who had the mantra of a local spirit, a local god also called Chatan. And as the Shankuni tells us, they actually exchange these mantras. So we don't have, in the story at least, we don't have the notion of elaborate diksha, elaborate initiation, but rather a case of two masters of mantras exchanging their experience, but also exchanging the mantras for a particular deity who can fulfill their wishes. So the one interpretation of this very short story is that there was a space for those families to exchange their practices, and as you can see here, exchange of practices from different communities, different castes, from a Mantravadi who belonged to a very famous Brahmin community, and those practitioners from Tia, a non-Brahmanic community. So I think that's quite an interesting point of how. There was a space and there is a space for change and for working with different mantras. And here I would like to point to the name mentioned there, the Chatan, sometimes called a Kuti Chatan, and a very interesting local deity who is not only um, worshipped in certain family traditions, but also family temples. But when you go to the sacred groves, like you can see in the picture here, some of them would have, for instance, a goddess as a main deity. It might be a goddess her form as Virujit or Darukajit, or some kind of fierce goddess who is shown in her form when she actually vanquished and killed the demons. So in most cases, she's in this ugra mood that needs a special attention of the ritual practitioners. But the Chatan, as a very helpful deity, is installed and consecrated in many cases in those temples, in this consecrated groves as well, and has this power of fulfilling their wishes. In some cases, Chatan would have his own temples. But it's also the case of, again, having the space of different type of empowerments. And as you can see in the picture over here, Kuti basically means a small one, a little one. So Kuti Chatan has this particular legend where he's living in a forest as a little boy, and then he's not aware of his basically his lineage. He's in some stories he's born as a son of Shiva. He's also called Vishnu Maya, but he's living in the forest and very wild and not restricted lifestyle, and he's not aware of his powers. He's not aware of who he really is. And one of the stories tells us that during his journey, he comes across a Brahmin or a sage or someone who tells him that he has a mission. He has a mission to vanquish the demons, to actually help people. And then that's the first part of his empowerment. He learns something about himself, and then immediately he doesn't recognize his power and his identity. identity, but he needs to travel to meet goddess. In some cases, it's goddess Parvati, who tells him exactly the story about the demon he needs to deal with. And that's an important story because we have multiple ritual practices, but also festivals and ceremonies, where we have a very similar story about a goddess who is created to, in many cases, it's Bhadra Kali, who is created out of God's powers to uh, basically destroy certain demonic forces. It might be a particular demon. So we have in those stories an indication of some kind of mission that these deities have, and also the multiple notions of identity. And I love the story about Kuttichatan because it shows also the connection of the deity has with multiple families. And the story also tells us about practitioners who learn the mantras of goddess, but then the goddess gave them the vision, and they said, well, we also need the empowerment, and I need to do the tapas, and I need to have the special sadhana to master the mantra of Chatan. So there is a lot of power relations, but it is not like higher and lower. There is the multiple sources of the empowerment that it's shown in the sacred groves in many cases. So that's what I was talking about. That's the notion of those traditions persisting in a family, let's say, context is related to taking care of certain holy groves, the so-called cavs, that in many cases may have a structure overbuilt over them, like a temple structure, a compound, certain shrines, but they still have this element of wilderness, and that's where in many cases the mantras and the ritual practices are ways of practitioners to connect with different environmental also forces. So many of those sacred rituals are performed outside of the temple, where the shrines of Kuchichatan are, for instance, are at the borders of the temple. So these are quite important spaces also that we need to um, uh, research when we talk about rediscovering of certain ritual practices. When I discussed a specific a ritual manual in my book that is preserved in the family and refers to ritual practices of krama from pre-temple time. So we have this indication that those goddesses, the 12 goddesses of krama, for instance, were invoked and practice and basically the practitioners would do the offerings for them in a external way. That's the external puja, but also as for the krama is also a system of obviously a meditation and the internal practice. And both of these practices, the external and the internal, are connected within the sacred growth. So when we are talking about these traditions, it's also important to mention the spaces where the practitioners can use those mantras. Now, uh, I mentioned that many of the holy groves are devoted to goddesses, warrior goddesses, and these powers of these goddesses in modern times, what I notice are many times used for healing. So that's another aspect that I wanted just to briefly mention. Uh, I talk about a particular Nayar tradition, family tradition in northern Kerala, where they have the main Kula Devata as Shulini, and it refers again to the power of the goddess and the spear of that's. In many cases, we have the stories about uh, goddess using this spear to basically defeat the demons. But in that particular tradition, it has also the practitioners they also have initiation in Krama and Shrividya. Shulini is invoked in healing practices, in healing rituals. So the mantra here it's used that it's actually found also in a text like Mantravāda, which is an early Shakta uh, text of Kerala. In Mantravāda, we don't have a reference to Krama as such or Krama um, uh, mantras or ritual systems, but it is very early Shakta tantric ritual manual. It gives us certain ideas how the Shakta rituals were prominent and how they influence the modern practices. And we have the same mantra also in the family practice, used in a different context. So here we have the story in Matrisalbhava about warrior goddess going to kill the demon Daruka, and we have the whole story in the context of ritual, and in the modern practice, that Shulini is invoked also in her form as a healer. So that's the power that is used in modern times. Right, so that's what is called a Shulini Prakriya Bali. So there is an um, in that particular ritual context in a Naya tradition, we have a Shulini who is usually invoked in Mantravada in other places, also for Marana or Uchatana, some kind of very dangerous rites. She's invoked in the form of Asura Mardini, but also as a healer. So I think that's an important example how goddesses are actually mentioned in several different contexts. And for instance, in a commentary on a collection of tantric rituals and collection of mantras called Tantra Sarasamgraha, that's available in a published form. And we also find the Shulini mantra, and the same mantra is basically used for in healing practices. Right, so let me just go to just to introduce that's another family that I was had a pleasure to work with, who introduced me to the clan Lineage. And as you can see here, we have a Nayar rather than Brahmin tradition with a particular sampradayas that received a vision of Kali. And the story of the particular Mantrika Nayar family, the Mepat, is very complex, but there is again a legend or a story about the origin of the tradition that refers to a particular Siddhas coming to Kerala. And we have the empowerment that the current practitioners received from the visions of the deity, the visions of the goddess, and the visions of the ancestors who asked them to reveal the traditions to the wider public, to actually also rework on certain temple practices. But we have this notion of siddhas traveling to Kerala and having and establishing a particular place, a particular sacred groves where they could be full-time practitioners. So that's quite important because when we talk about changes of the ritual practice and why, for instance, we have krama only in certain ways invoked. The Kalasamkarshini, for instance, in modern times is invoked in much simplified pujas rather than what we find in ritual manuals. Well, the one reason is that the ritual manuals from the early tradition, it's hard to say exactly at the time, but as the story goes of the particular family, it's that it was the time where practitioners could be full-time practitioners, so they wouldn't need to, for instance, do their pujas in the temples and as it is as it is now. Um, uh, right. So we have another terms that are used. I'm paying attention to these terms because I feel it's meaningful to point to certain spaces where the ritual systems are preserved. For instance, these practitioners here point to their space where the mantras are practiced as mantra shala, and it uses, can see here, there is a notion of Samaya Vidya. And Samaya Vidya again connects, invokes the Tripura goddess to the ritual space that otherwise we have in the same ritual space we have Mahartha Puja, where we have the invocations to Kali. So I think, and when we talk about these traditions, it's worth to talk about spaces that are shared by different divinities, and obviously the ritual adepts who know how to invoke those deities and change uh, the moods sometimes. That's a very important part of the practice. Right. So, to sum up this part of my presentation, it's basically about the notion of revelation and a complex ritual practice that's in modern times has a strong influence of various esoteric traditions, including Shaiva Krama and Shrividya, but also about a particular space that allows the transmission and interconnection of different ritual systems. Especially, we need to talk about festivals. And often in the sacred groves, it's a case of annual festivals where when those special secret pujas are performed. But it is also a time where different practitioners from different communities are invited. So that's a special time where this tradition is alive also because we have the unique system of cooperation of practitioners from different communities. And now I would like to move to text themselves for the rest of my presentation. And we have text, early text like Shaivaga Manibandhana or the text that I already mentioned, Matrasabhava. So and it's hard to date them. Matrasabhava I sometimes talk about a text that was composed in 11th or perhaps the 13th century, and Shaivaga Manibandhana is also one of the early Shaiva texts. So I just quoted some from one verse from those texts to see that the textual sources are also telling us something about how complex these systems were, where Vedic mantras, Vedic and Tantric mantras combine, and Tantric practice itself was also explained that these type of practices were either followed by different communities or can be practiced by someone. And again, in Mantravada, we have the notion of the highest tantric teacher, the someone who is the best guru, the Uttama one, who needs to be expert in not only Shaiva, but in not only the rituals that of his or her tradition, but needs to know all the Shaiva and Shakta practices. So that's also an indication of the the ability that was required for tantric practitioners, and that's also mentioned in like modern studies. Well, the Shakta element is basically mentioned as something that remains either open or in some form in many practices. Right. So when I started my research in Kerala, I was fascinated by finding the Srividya mantras, Srividya elements in uh, text like Mantravada or Samuchaya, which is Samuchaya is basically an additional text as so-called supplement to Tantra Samuchaya, and these texts are not introducing themselves as Srividya, but they actually mention certain elements like Navayoni chakra. And then the question I started asking when I was doing my research on Srividya in Kerala was uh, how possible it is and how these texts are not actually mentioning any type of dikshas. And I was fascinated by finding these elements, and that actually pushed me into direction of finding those interconnections, those elements that are common in certain systems. And what we can see even in the texts that are like standard texts, like Shesha Samuchaya is very popular text, teaching, for instance, rituals for especially rituals of festivals or rituals for goddesses in Kerala. So I would the first thing I found was the textual reference to Sri Vidya mantras and Sri Chakra as well, in texts that are not introducing themselves as Sri Vidya. And now we have another very peculiar verse from Shesha Samuchaya. So we have text from 15th century. I think mostly we can date it this way. And here the text says, well, certain elements that are required for a ritual practice in the chapter 7. Uh, you have mentioned also the Matrividya, which might be a different type of mantra, but we have a Samaya Vidya that is required. You need to use different forms of Gayatri, and you have a reference to Pancha Pranava, for instance, where the Pancha Pranava is also a type of mantra knows from Kashmiri Shaiva text. So these references are just not fully explaining how the system functions at certain time, but it gives us an idea of how complex and composite the system is. So now I would like to turn to the um, text that I actually edited, that I also found the similarities and with the text like Shirsamuchaya in the form of invocations. But basically, that's the text, the Nitya Puja, and also part of what I edited as part of the Hara. Nitya Puja is a text that is one of the texts that shows us an early Krama system. Now, just to point at the different peculiar elements of this early system that is preserved in certain form today, we have again different forms of empowerment through guru lineages that are from Kerala and from Kashmir. And we have this invocation of goddesses from Kama tradition. We have the opening of invocation to Maheshwari, and then we have lineages that lead from Mangala Devi to the guru who is actually from Kerala. Most we can identify the Prabhutananda guru, and you can see here that it's also the text is quite unique in a way. It combines Sanskrit and Malayalam in terms, but also in mantras. So again, it's the way that the tradition is stressing that it has its local and very unique form. Here, I just mentioned the sequence of ritual that it's mentioned in the text, and I would like to just what I stressed here. The first of all, the yogic practice of purification that. Opens the ritual manual. The ritual manual, as you can see here, is preserved in the form of a palm leaf manuscript, and reading a palm leaf manuscript might be challenging, and also it might be very satisfying when you finally get some kind of structure. This structure was, I mean, the palm leaves were mixed up when I got this manuscript, and there were many different side notes. But the yogic practice of purification refers to again to different spaces, and even though it was practiced by the practitioners in the sacred context of sacred grove, but we have the reference of to the smashana, to the place of the revelation of Krama, of the original, and that's where we have the special invocation to very unique deities, for instance, Mahakrama Ganapati. What kind of form of Ganapati it is, and it's very interesting to find. There is no description of it, but we have the different forms of Ganapati also specifically called Mahakrama. Or sometimes Mahaartha. Then, as you can see in the point 10 and 11, we have two forms of worship from Krama tradition. Now, I will tell you in a minute that it's not only krama, but we have puja krama and samvit krama. And we have first we start with the ritual practice that it's about purification also of the space and specific offerings of to the goddess, and then we go to the Samvit Krama, where we have the meditation of the sequence of goddesses, the sequence of goddesses, and going from Srishti to Anakya Krama, the different forms of consciousness, and that's a more meditative practice. So again, here that's the stress of the names of the transmission of the lineage, and that's also appears in the section of Nyasa Krama. So we have this imposition of mantras and the lineages on the body of the practitioner. Just very quickly, we have again we have the different forms of transmission when we have this threefold Olga, the Divyoga, Siddhoga, and Manavoga gurus. And again, if you look at the text here, I tried to find the interrelations with the other Krama texts like Devi Panchashataka, and we have the here in the Divyoga we have the direct reference to Odhyana Pitha, and then to Karavira Smashana, and that's these situate us in a very different also historical um, ritual context. So that's the one thing. Another thing that's today I wanted to talk about mantras, and there are some quite unique names of the mantras. For instance, at some point, the practitioners is asked to use a Vyalika mantra, which is a secret mantra. So we don't know exactly how it is composed, but again, it refers to the to Vartuka. And the Vatuka and Kshatrapala, for instance, is also invoked here, and it's described as Kshapanaka, which is, and again, a very unique name, and it connects us to perhaps it asks certain questions why name was used, but this Vyala and Vyalika are in many cases names of some unique mantras that are used in this particular tradition. We have also a concept of kilaka in the text. So certain mantras needs to be unlocked. There is a concept of mantras being basically codified. And here I just give you some examples of how the goddesses are invoked. The whole text I edited so you can find it in my publication, but I'll just give you some ideas. You can have here um, uh, names of goddesses that obviously connect with the Krama notions of Bhasa and Anakya, all these chakras, and we have Bhasa Amba, Anakya Amba, Samhara Amba, and Sthiti and Srishti Amba that are worshipped. But I would like to point to the way they are worshipped, and that's a part of nyasa. But what the practitioner is asked to do is to visualize a Navayoni chakra over his head and then place or impose those goddesses on the Navayoni chakra. So we have quite a compositive way of dealing with these mantras and these goddesses. So these are I don't want to in too many details, but I just wanted to give you some ideas, of how the mantras are constructed. For instance, in case of when the Sthiti Kali is invoked, and I just give you some few ways that she is invoked. She's also invoked with the mantra of 100 syllables. Now, the 100 syllables mantra is recited mentally and visualized. So it gives us some idea that the mantras were also used in some cases like stotras when you have for like practice of reading and reciting stotra and meditating on names of goddesses, but you have initiation and you know the mantras and you can decode the stotra in a particular way and get something more than a person who is not initiated, but because you read this invocation through your knowledge of mantras. So that's one way the mantras function. One of the uh, one of the interesting point here is that uh, in a yogic practice, these invocations to those goddesses are in 2 points, in Dvadashanta and Shodashanta, above head. So that's where the 12 Kalis are actually imagined and visualized. I think that's one of the unique thing of this system, that these two are used when we mostly in text we have either 12 or 16. Here we have both. So again, there's a question of where this system comes from. And just one more thing about how that concept of Mantravada and being initiated, being proficient in many mantras functions here is that we have to have someone who is proficient in the mantras like we have here, for instance, the one for you, the mantra of Mahachanda Yogeshwari, but we have also someone who can invoke Maha Tripura Sundari. So these very complex systems require much more than an initiation to Kali, for instance, to Krama, but to have an experience of mantras. So to not to give you too much today, I just wanted to summarize these points by pointing to the notion that I wanted to introduce in the beginning, the idea of mantras connecting not only a person to a particular deity or being a source of and a vehicle of empowerment, a way to receive the grace of deity, but also mantras as certain ways of connecting traditions. This example that I gave in the beginning about these two brothers exchanging mantras, perhaps it points to his more profound historical process that maybe ongoing process of these traditions not being isolated because we often talk about restriction to the access to a particular local or family traditions. But I also would like to point that perhaps we should talk also more about not this. Traditions being isolated, but actually these transmissions of mantras going in different directions and connecting those traditional ways of worship. Well, thank you for very much. I think that's something that I wanted to share with you today. If you have any questions, thank you.
Thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. I feel like, we could have had you go on for other hours and there'd still be things that we'd want to learn more about. So the way that we'll do this is just go ahead and use the hand raise function. I will ask you then to unmute and you can ask your question. Just to get us started, there's so many forms of the goddess, right? And then the question is, you either pick one or you have multiple ones within a system. And so you could think about a lot of different models, like there's maybe the Dasha Mahavidya model where there's all these forms of the goddess, but how do you differentiate them? How do you relate them? Maybe it's not so clear until, like Ganapati Muni then gives the structure. For Abhinavagupta, he combines Thrika and Krama into a single synthetic process. In the Sarvamnaya, there's a Krama Diksha where one goes from one to the next, and then there's an ongoing meta narrative about the different Amnayas and how they're all spoken by the different faces of Lord Shiva. So I think if I'm trying to read between the lines, are you kind of introducing a different model of how to integrate across different traditions, which is sort of a more less structured but an interpersonal exchange of mantras? Or can you just tell us a little bit more about how you would see the integration of the local traditions, the Srividya, the Krama, the Vaidika, maybe? So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what's your model of integration.
I think the problem is it really differs from one like a family or a community way of integrating these elements. That's why I think I started by pointing to my reading of the text that was given to me the first time I was in Kerala and I was reading about common ritual practices, and that's why I read the Shesha Samuchaya, and then I found these mantras just out of sudden uh, in a particular context, and then I see, well, that's exactly like you take a Khatgamala stotra and you take a part of it and you invoke these deities in a new context. But I think what I find interesting is that we have multiple examples of temples where Sri Chakra was installed, but we have different forms of worship of the Sri Chakra, unique for the family. So that's one unique feature. So I'm not saying that a situation in Kerala in this complexity and the way the goddesses are invoked in totality, it's very different from. It's so unique that you don't have examples like that in other places of India or Nepal. It's not true. Obviously, you have the Savamnaya, you have the all these teachers who can initiate you in the practice of mantras from different goddesses. You have to invoke Mahadashavidya in Sri Vidya context and so on. But what I found interesting is, for instance, the Sri Vidya mantra, the Bala mantra, is given to practitioners of different families. So that was my inspiration to research a bit more about Bala Tripura Sundari, who is invoked, to my knowledge, there is no a temple as such devoted to only to Bala Tripura Sundari in Kerala, but it might be. But what I found fascinating, the stotras for Bala Tripura Sundari are chanted within different contexts, and this uh, the mantra of Bala is basically given as the first mantra that can then allow you to practice Sri Chakra Puja. And that's why it is so important for many practitioners to receive it, whether in within the family, as at certain time, at certain age, a person may receive this mantra, or from a particular guru. So I think that's an important aspect that's practitioners may not introduce themselves, or I'm a Shri Vidya Upasaka, but they still may practice certain mantras nevertheless. That it's I was pointing more to the names and terms that we use that may indicate a different like constellations of these practices.
Yeah, really, really helpful. So first, Shank, I'd like you to ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I have a lot of thoughts going on in my mind. So just for like some context, I study Shaivism, and one of the things that like I've noticed kind of is as you kind of approach the modern period, you see sort of the recession really of what I would call like Shakta, like goddess-centric practices. And kind of related to kind of your comment that we tend to view certain traditions through the lens of like access, like who has access to these traditions. And like certainly like in my own kind of like studies, I have found generally that the Sri Vidya is very strongly associated with Tamil Brahmins. Um, and I and I find that your provocation really interesting. You're encouraging us to see the Sri Vidya and other kind of Shakta traditions as cutting across different communal boundaries, and it offers like a very different narrative of like what has actually been happening historically. And so I guess like I'm curious, and in light of what you said about how like the texts like the Matra Sadbhava are enjoining practitioners to gain mastery over Shaiva and Shakta mantras. I'm wondering if you can kind of comment on like perhaps the kind of trans-regional valences of these practices. Like, are these like things that are purely originating in Kerala and traveling to other places, or are these practices that have been lost elsewhere and have traveled to Kerala? Because like I'm thinking of just the kind of the connections of like Shaiva practice that are diffuse between Tamil Nadu and Kerala. I hope this question makes sense. Like because I, as far as like I know, the economy of mantra practice that you're talking about doesn't really exist like in Tamil Nadu or in Karnataka, as far as I'm aware. But I don't know. Please let me know if that question needs to be rephrased.
Okay, I will try to, best of my knowledge, to say something about perhaps from the perspective of what I experience and what I notice in Kerala, and the regions like Palakkad, for instance, where it's near Tamil region.
Yeah,
That's an interesting case of mm, gurus who come from there and receive initiation, and they have this connection with um, lineages from Tamil Nadu, but at the
yeah,
same time they connect to in case of Sri Vidya they connect to much um, uh, lineages, for instance, of Bhaskara, and that's an interesting case when I noticed in northern Kerala, for instance, where they say, well, the Sri Vidya that we practice is the Kaula Sri Vidya, then in sense that they they say, well, there are many practices in modern Sri Vidya, according to, for instance, Parashurama Kalpa Sutra, and these elements of Kaula worship, where you have this Panchamakara, for instance, is not present anymore. And there are some practitioners who say, well, in our Shaktiya system, these Kaula elements are still practiced.
Interesting.
So that's again how these practitioners would introduce themselves and perhaps say something unique about their practice. They would point to this element of Kaula where you have Shividya also. You have this various forms of Shividya practice of Shankaracharyas and
Yeah, yeah.
that's a different system. But here I feel obviously there are many researchers talking about the influence of like regional or regions that are nearby. So obviously we can talk about a wider scope of when Kerala was a part of the Pamon region, for instance. And when I did my research on Kalaripayattu, which is the martial art of Kerala, uh, I noticed there was a similar situation about the lineages, where the practitioners, many of the practitioners of Kalaripayattu are also initiated in certain tantric practices. So this system is influenced very strongly with Tantra. And they talk about the gurus coming from Karnataka, for instance, that some of the obviously Kalaripayattu has different variations, northern style, central style, or southern style of Kalaripayattu. But this martial art has also elements of Tantra, and these gurus are also talking about, for instance, being some kind of legendary warriors, gurus coming from Karnataka. So that's one connection. That's a fascinating topic itself. I mentioned this North Kerala from Kannur, this Nayar traditions, and they also call their temple Kalari, which is quite unique. Which Kalari is basically a space where the martial art is practiced. So the temple itself is called Kalari mostly because it invokes those fierce and powerful goddesses. I don't know if I answered your question, but I feel that that's the unique feature here, and
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's the start of a much longer conversation. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Next, Sai, if you'd ask your question.
Hi. Can you guys hear me actually? I'm Maciej. Hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you so much for sharing your groundbreaking research. This whole topic of Mantravada has been a really topic of great interest to me. Um, you know, in one of your slides, you mentioned regarding the Shaktiya Brahmana, the Mantravadins, and then there's the Vaidiki Tantra. So that really piqued my interest in the sense because Kerala has a lot of big Nambudiri community, that I think they're big in Rig Veda. I think that's their main shaka, and they still practice a lot of the old traditions there. I was wondering, what does this really, if you can elaborate a little bit on it, it's like what does it really entail? Are they using the ancient Śākta practices of doing things, or is it more like a Smarta influence thing, or is it more like a unique offshoot that they practice, including their chata and their local groove related stuff? Because it's very interesting because I've never seen really as such the Vedic Tantra, and yeah, if you can just share your thoughts on it.
Right. So Vaidika Tantra is basically nowadays used as a name of a tantric system, the dominant tantric system of the Nambudiri Brahmins, and the ritual practices are based on a text now, the text that's called the Tantra Samuccaya. So the text that instructs on the main ritual practices in the temples. That's basically a temple practice, requiring pratishtha, punar all type of installation, all type of pujas for specific gods, and how to perform the daily and special rituals. That's why I mentioned the Shesha Samuchaya, which is added to this as a Shesha as an additional part, and to mention the special festivals and festival rules. So these are like basic ritual manuals that are used. In Kerala, you have institutions teaching tantric practice as a temple practice. So basically training temple priests. So the most famous one is in Alua, Tantra Vidyapidha, and basically mostly the Brahmins who want to become temple priests are trained. You receive a degree, so to say, and then you might be appointed at certain temples, right? So there are obviously Vedic traditions as such, where you have as you mentioned, Rigvedic Brahmins, you have different Shakas, Somavedins, where they are still practicing, and there are a lot of studies precisely about how the Vedic tradition is preserved. So that's a bit different topic, like how the Vedic mantras are now preserved, and there are studies of, whether mantras, Vedic mantras can be still received in the same way, or because we have a new technology can then be recorded, and so on and so on. So that's a different story. And the Vaidika Tantra is the system in which you have tantric rituals, mostly about temple rituals, but you use Vedic mantras, and you are trained also mostly in because you are mostly a Brahmin, so you also got all the samskaras. You have your family lineage, for instance. So the Vaidika system is basically now referred to as the system encoded in the Tantra Samuchaya. The important thing is, as I noticed, is that new ritual manuals are being published. So like digests of Tantra Samuchaya, especially for practitioners who are learning in this school. You can compare it to university learning, where you get new editions of handbooks, and that's what's happening now. I can notice that there is a need of explanation of rituals in the temples, and that's changing because we have many new gurus publishing their own manuals in a format of a paper publication. So
If it's okay, can I just add one small point, or
Please.
right.
Yeah. So, in one of your slides, you mentioned where the two brothers exchange the Ganapati mantra with another mantra. It's more of like an anecdote I read a couple of years ago there's a Kamakoti Mandali blog. I think most people know that. In there, there's a story between the Sringeri Guru, where not this one, but the previous one, where he was supposed to learn Nyaya or something from a learned Shastra person, but the Shastra person, the Pandit, refused because he's a guru, right? Sringeri Jagat Guru. But the Jagat Guru quoted a specific thing where in the Dharma Shastra or some Shastra, I can look for it, where you can exchange vidyas or you can give dhanadana. Basically, you can give some kind of offering in the sense of wealth, both usually cows or land, to exchange these kind of vidyas. So, when you mentioned that, I just remembered. Maybe I can look for it and look for it where there's like the specific mention of exchange of these things. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I noticed also that there is what I mentioned, the revelation and people who receive mantras in their dreams or in the visions. So that's also a modern thing that it's not only modern, but it's happening as well. So that's also a source of mantras.
Yes. Next up, we have Ajit. Please go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Maciej, for a wonderful session on cultural practice of Shakta tradition in Kerala and its connection with the Krama. And my question here is, these practices are followed by the Brahmin families who are preserving and continuing these transmissions to the next generations and so on. But the non-Brahmins in the Kerala's consider these Shaktapitas or cow in Malayalam as a like a
Ajit, you've cut out. Could you restart your question?
protection from the serpent powers, the local places, localities. See, such am I audible? Hello,
Yeah, you cut out a little bit.
hello.
You'd mentioned you were starting to
Yeah,
talk about how the non-Brahmin communities practice. So could
yeah,
you start from
huh.
there?
Yeah. See, non-Brahminical people or the audience in Kerala, they are considering these cows as a serpent powers which are protecting those places wherever these Shaktapitas are situated. So this practice are came from these agamas or any krama traditional or directly connected with the tradition, or those are evolved later in the particular places.
Okay. If I can
Thank you.
just answer, thank you. If I understand your question, I feel that yes, that there are multiple different kind of carvers. There are sarpa carvers, also a very beautiful one, Haripat, for instance. And yeah, so I feel that there are different sources of the rituals that we practice now, that are practiced now in different carvers. So carvers sometimes they belong to a particular family. Sometimes the covers change the owners. Sometimes they are open to the community, where the community, basically people living nearby, perform the rituals, and that's uh, at some point perhaps the Nambudiri Brahmin might be appointed there, but there is a long tradition in certain kavus where only the people who live nearby, they just come and perform certain rituals, and they don't need a special initiation or training from a Brahmin, because they have the local tradition that the goddess, for instance, accepts offerings from people living nearby because they are her children. So that's the empowerment that comes from the local community beliefs. So I feel that yeah, what you mentioned, the serpents, obviously that's is a big thing about uh, worship of nagas, Nagayakshi, for instance, and that's something worth researching. But I think we my opinion is that we need to focus on a specific case. In some cases, yes, this owners of the particular place were now receiving the mantras and performing the rituals within their traditions. Perhaps if we go back in the time and see how this tradition to change, that we can see the different influences. I'm particularly very interested in those cases of kavus that are may belong to a particular family, but at certain points in time, they were basically spaces where local people would come and ask protection from different deities, and they were invoking goddesses or serpents as well. And you have the practice of worshiping of serpents and basically connecting with the serpents in multiple places, in multiple also family grounds. So I think that's the case of a specific space, specific place.
We also have a question from the chat that kind of links into this, and the question is about invoking these divine and semi-divine figures in the groves. The audience member says, this is a really interesting topic. Is there a way that the practitioners there gain the guidance of these beings linked to the mandala of the goddesses being worshipped? So what is the nature of this connection and relationship?
Right. So I think apart from like the usual case of being like receiving a diksha and having a sadhana where you have the particular steps where you follow what the guru's instruction, I think that's an interesting case also of Kutichatan because that's a deity that especially in the northern part of Kerala, what I noticed is specifically said to be um, belong to a particular family, that they have a very strong connection, and in some cases, the representations or the manifestations of that deity in different forms, a form of a stone or a form of you have a particular murti. These are kept secret. These are kept in a locked room, and the people from outside are not allowed to see them, and the explanation for that is that they could be frightened, and if that's the case there is a change of mood, there is a change of energies in that place, and it may cause some disturbance. So there's only some people who can actually quote unquote control the chatan because they have this special family connection, and that's, I think, it's even more unique than the connection with the goddesses. Obviously, there is a connection through a long upasana or a connection through the goddess being also a guardian of a particular family. But in case of Kutichatan, in many cases, that's some kind of secret that also cannot be revealed in the form of you cannot see the chatan outside the household, which is quite different from temples of Kutichatan in, for instance, in Trishul, where you have a big and openly worshipped chatans from for by the local pilgrims and devotees. So I think that's different cases of how the secrecy also is linked to empowerment and connection with the deity is necessarily influenced the mood of the deity. So I mentioned that these goddesses are often in the very fierce mood, that the Ugra or Ati Ugra, and there are specific rituals that need to pacify them after the main ceremonies. So we have this idea of also heat and cold, elements, and some of the goddesses are being more hot than cold. There is a lot of elements of the mood that needs to be specifically addressed during the ritual practice.
One of the things that you mentioned that I think would be of a lot of interest to our audience is you mentioned that there is the puja, the Brahma puja of the murtis, but then there's also the subtle mental practice. And if we think about three locations, Kathmandu, Kashmir, and Kerala, Kashmir is also kind of unique in that the way that it developed is that the mental practice is predominant there. And you could think about, I mean, the most recent text on mental practice would be Swami Lakshmanju's Sri Kramanaya Pradipika, for instance. And I wonder how much similarity there would be between, the mental practice as you're seeing it described in Kerala versus what maybe Swamiji would have prescribed or talked about.
Right, so I wouldn't like to talk about Krama and Kerala in general because I believe that outside the text that I read, that the differences might be quite significant. So only referring to that Nitya Puja, the text that I read, I find similarities, but I feel the text is uh, much more detailed, like the invocations to, for instance, to the guru lineages repeatedly, like they are repeated in different kramas. When you visualize again the final stage, the sequence of Anakya, when you visualize the goddesses in the Vadashanta. But before that, you contemplate the different lineages that are really sometimes confusing. Because the names are repeated within the lineage, and now the question is whether it is the same person or someone of the same name. There is, for instance, this reference to Shivananda. Whether this is the same Shivananda, no, it might be a very different person. So I feel there is a lot of pressure on the repetition of, especially after the siddhas, the names of the siddhas, and we have the going back with, for instance, if we have the Bahasa Krama, we have invocations to the Nathas, and quite unique names of yoginis. I think that's also quite unique in the sense that they are not really described. Well, in many Krama texts, we also have just names. We don't have descriptions. But we have the specific places where they need to be visualized and contemplated. And I think that's quite peculiar, that the specific places of in the body, specific nyasas of and we begin basically the nyasa system with the kalis being imposed on left eye, right eye, and only after these impositions of mantras within the body, we go to beyond, and we start this krama system, krama sequence of the meditation, where you basically achieve some kind of extension of consciousness to basically have the stages from Srishti to Anakhya. So I think that this nyasa and preparation of the body is quite important in this text, at least.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. What I want to do now is to put you in dialogue with Acharya Timalsina. And I see the second I introduced him, he got up. Oh, there we go. Okay. He was showing us Samhara. Okay. So Acharya ji, yeah, please unmute and chat a little bit.
I have nothing to chat, only to thank you. First of all, thank you, Dr. Karasinski. I've read your work. I need to read it more. And more than that, I have to appreciate you in person for the kind of work you are doing. We are getting this almost a turning point in my own way of thinking of the way field work is done today. I was remembering when before you started speaking, the first name came to my mind today was Dr. Fritz Stahl, who brought back to life Agni Chayana. And not that the priests have to accept this as a fact. Of course, these things always existed. These things were there and maybe being practiced in some remote parts of Kerala by a few Nambudiri Brahmins. But it has become so common that I was observing the Agni Chayana in Kathmandu in 1998. So anthropologists, there are two types. One are the ones who take these cultural artifacts as a museum piece and treat as such, and others who treat them as a living entity. And rather than rushing to declare dead, they seek life, and that is a kind of difference I make among all the scholars who are working in different aspects of Indian culture. And there's a personal connection, personal link, personal interest for me to learn from you, but let's set aside those personal things. I find it a human value to to enrich global human cultural asset by bringing these practices, these systems to public awareness. And I believe you have immensely helped in doing so. Please feel home at Vimarsha. Our objective is to go beyond these institutions. We need the formal university institutions for, let's say, our career, our livelihood, for our diploma, for our certificates. But we all know in the field of knowledge that when you offer a responsibility of the production of knowledge to some corporations, you already limit this boundless prativa trying to unfold with her own swatantra, with her own freedom. So we are trying to control the divine spontaneity, to hook and to control it for vested political and corporate interests. And so we do need, and even for us working in institutions, we need the platforms that are out of the control of the corporation interests and vested global colonial imperial interests. But there are a vast number of people who want to learn these things, and they deserve this knowledge, even if they cannot come to some of the finest colleges where we teach or where we earn our degrees. The sole and singular objective that drives me and my friends who have found Vimarsha as their home is to globalize this knowledge and make it accessible to everybody, whether the person is living in 12,000 feet high base camps in Nepal or in Africa or New Zealand or in the remote part of Chile. And we have made some progress in this regard, but this is not a one-person job. This is not something one person can do. And I have found helping hands on Dr. Danilo Costalima, Dr. Ravi Kudesia, and many other friends and students who have felt the same need to preserve, to practice, and to promote these ideas and make it accessible for the next generation globally. And I wish you the best, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I was glad to actually continue my research. That's my aim, and I will be happy to help whatever I can to contribute to the tantric studies, also in the sense of shedding new light on these practices. I'm now also interested in those connections between the systems, and obviously the inheritance of Kashmiri Krama in how it is still alive. So I do hope that my research can help with understanding, and I have a lot to learn, but I hope to help with this research as well. Thank you.